Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this Fleet Europe webinar supported by Visa. Today we are going to discuss mobility, or better said, the mobility maze. I don't know if you can see your way through. I sometimes can't, and so for me, it's also a very interesting topic to discuss. As we know, fleet management is evolving very fast, and today's fleets are no longer one size fits all. They combine different modes of transport. There are BEVs, there is employee owned vehicles, and so much more. Did you know that by 2028, almost 65% of businesses will reduce their company car fleets and they will increase diversity towards mobility solutions? Now, for employers and employees, they expect more flexible, digital first solutions that make managing journeys and payments effortless. But how to do that? That's what we are going to discuss together with our three guests today. To help you navigate the changing fleet and mobility landscape, may I invite Neil Holz, Director at Visa, Paul Holland, the Managing Director for the UK and Australia New Zealand at Corpay, and Jeff Terrell, Co-founder at CarCloud. Gentlemen, welcome. I hope that you are doing well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to be here.
You are all based in the UK, and probably you are very concerned about the decisions of the UK government in terms of transportation, and in particular, the pay-per-use tax for EVs that has been announced. But today we are going to discuss another topic. We are going to discuss the need for more flexible and also digital-first solutions to make mobility and also payments more effortless. So let's start, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, we would love to know a little bit more about yourself and about your company. So let's start with the introductions. First up, Neil, can you briefly introduce, let's say, yourself, your role, and also how do you see what role payment plays in the broader mobility ecosystem?
Sure, thanks, Stephen. So good to meet everyone. So Neil Horse, I work for Visa in our fleet and B2B mobility team. So my background previously was across banking propositions and also at OEM in my early career. So it's really good to be working back in the industry. I think from a payments perspective, if we were to look at when I joined a few years ago, we were just a fleet team in Visa and relatively new. Very quickly, we realised that need to transition to be fleet and mobility because, even in that time that's passed in those few years, the transition is happening pretty quickly. And so covering across all of those different use cases is super important. From a payments perspective, I think the easiest way for me to sum it up is the fact that nearly every journey starts or ends or in between, there's a need for a payment. Nothing happens without that transaction and that money movement. And so our role at Visa is try to see how we can improve that journey, both for the end users, but also make it easier for fleet managers to rationalize the journeys and complexity in the current market. So really pleased to join. Thanks, Stephen.
Okay. And would you say that you're on the right track in making payment easier and more effortless for fleets when it comes to mobility?
Yeah, there's something magical called tokenization, and I'm sure we'll cover a little bit more detail, but the ability to have a single card and be able to then embed that across multiple use cases, but always have that single source of truth. I think that's the element that's going to really help. But from a Visa perspective, we're just the platform and the rails. I think the innovation comes from our partners in this space, and it's really, really exciting area at the moment. There's so many fintechs entering the market thinking I can help solve this problem, and so we're there to support, but really the partners are doing an incredible job to create these great new experiences for both fleet managers and end users.
Okay, one of those partners is Corpay. We have with us today Paul Holland. Hello, Paul. Can you introduce CorePay and how does your business at CorePay support fleet and mobility payments?
Thanks, Stephen, and good morning, everybody. Great to be here. Yeah, CorePay, we're a global payments business. We help companies with a whole range of payment solutions across corporate, lodging, and vehicle payments, vehicle mobility payments. My role within CorePay, I'm the managing director of our UK and Australia and New Zealand fleet businesses. Been in payments for most of my working career. And here in the UK, our principal activities are really around fuel and EV payments, but also around business expenses. And we'll talk about it a little bit more as the show goes on. But clearly, the needs and the requirements of businesses are expanding on a whole multitude of ways. Here in the UK, we trade under three companies. All Star, Key Fuels, and the Fuel Card Company. And as I say, a lot of our business is around fuel and EV, but very much helping those larger companies getting involved with broader mobility solutions.
Okay. You are both heading the UK activities and the activities in Australia and New Zealand. I can imagine that you have quite a lot of air miles.
A lot of air miles and a lot of sleepless nights, but there's quite a correlation between the geographies, so it's quite helpful to be able to compare and contrast and leverage our capabilities across different geographies.
Okay, perfect. Then our third guest, Jeff Terrell, of co-founder at CarCloud. Jeff, also for you, can you introduce CarCloud and how can you simplify mobility and vehicle management for your customers and the organizations here in the webinar?
So thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. Yes, so co-founder at CarCloud, and what we do at CarCloud is we provide businesses of all sizes with a vehicle and driver management platform that gives that singular view to overcome this increasing complexity. And that singular view is that start point for cost control, so cutting cost, reducing risk, and getting full visibility of payments.
Okay, perfect. Gentlemen, let's have an engaged discussion. And to the participants, to the audience, if you have a question for our experts, for our guests during this webinar, then you can submit your question via the chat, because at the end of our discussion, we have time to take a couple of questions from you, our audience. So let's start. I would love to start with Neil. Neil, question for you. We, of course, see it each and every day. The mobility environment is changing dramatically. What are for you and for Visa the biggest forces making fleet and mobility more complex on an international level?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that if we start with the basics, we're moving from a cars to a journeys solution. So if I need to travel for business, employees are looking to see what's the best, most efficient way for me to do that. So from a fleet manager perspective, that opens up a whole raft of complexities. So I guess the multimodal element of the travel, if you look at big cities now, we've got congestion charges, clean air charges, a reduction in parking. There's a lot of challenges which essentially are saying don't bring your vehicle into this city. And so one of the challenges around that is I no longer wake up, go to a meeting and drive my vehicle and arrive at the destination like I may have done in the past. I have to plot my journey. I have to work out parking. I need to work out potentially EV charging now, fueling, plus I've got to pay for transit. You know, the emergence of micro mobilities as well plays another factor, plus ride hailing. So there's so many factors and elements to this. You know, there's options for employees to make the most efficient route. And then you have to overlay some of the challenges around regulation, localized regulation as well, which doesn't make it easy for a fleet manager that's certainly looking after more than one market. We're seeing lots of changes at local level. And then I think you have to overlay things like ESG reporting. You've got to think about fraud and making sure that actually your overall people movement is efficient and cost effective. So one of the things for me is, the challenge then comes, even if I solve that, what does good look like? So how do I actually manage against the behavior of my employees? compared to other businesses? Who can give me those kind of insights? And then I think also, there's always a call for data, and more data is becoming available, but it's got to be actionable. So how do you use that data in order to make actions? Yeah, and I think one of the things that we see from a Visa perspective is in making payments real time, you can be much more agile about the way that you respond. So potential fraudulent activity, you can cancel the card instantly and the next transaction will be declined. So you have an element of control over that mobility space. But as I touched on before, there's many partners now that are working towards bringing those insights together to make them more actionable and more seamless for a fleet manager to manage that transition.
Okay, thank you. Then coming to you, Paul, first of all, do you agree what Neil already stipulated as some of the main challenges? And then to go further, do you also agree that the employees in the organizations that you work with are increasingly seeing the company car, the vehicle, as a burden rather than a perk, and especially in main cities, in city centers where there are congestion charges, pedestrian zones, limited parking? Is that also what you are seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Fully agree with Neil's comments. The environment which fleets are operating, the environment which businesses are operating are hugely complex. They're evolving, they're dynamic, and there's a real need to be agile. So, you're looking for solutions that can help you respond to the challenges that the business or the environment may throw at you. I think in terms of the company vehicle, it's pretty complex, because I think in certain circumstances, it's crystal clear the kind of mobility solution that you may use for a particular segment of a workforce. And if you've got a sales manager or an account manager doing 30,000 miles a year or whatever else, they need a company car, and that's going to be the most effective way for them to get about. But then when you look at the role of the fuel, or what's happened with the fuel transition, and the way that governments have used taxation to encourage people to do different things, the threshold in which it's worth having a company car in certain geographies is very different. And then you start to encounter salary sacrifice, and you start to encounter car allowance schemes, and require different kind of solutions. So without question, the world is getting much more complex. Businesses are operating on a much broader geographic footprint. And I think, we've got to, as a company, you have to balance up the needs for the control of the company with the flexibility for the employee. And what you don't want to do is burn your employees' time, either by being, kind of administrative burdening with the way that they might be able to, they might have to move around, or force them down a route that just isn't effective. So I think there's multiple kind of slants that come into play, and I think the most successful businesses that manage this situation is having flexible solutions, but are pointed enough to give the business its appropriate controls in the areas where it needs control.
Okay. And what would be then your main advice to those organizations? Because you just mentioned, okay, what is really key, what is really important is that as an organization, as an employer, that you can find that sweet balance between, on the one hand, cost control, but also control over the expenses over your employees. And at the other hand, you want to give your employees, where feasible, where possible, more flexibility, and give them also the freedom to use mobility in the best way possible for them. So, but how do you do that? Because it can be a complex exercise in this, let's assume, and also be honest, often over-regulated environment and changing environment that we are living in.
100% agree. And I think, kind of the reality is that the whole situation is about balance. It's balancing the needs of the business, balancing the needs of the employees. But I think people that have kind of joined this webinar who are keen to learn more about mobility are kind of on the track, because it's all about knowledge. It's about, the art of what's out there, to understand what may be the better solution to scope for your company. I think the other thing is that employees have got big voices. They tell you when things are not going wrong. They tell you when their time is being burnt. They tell you when it's not efficient. So I think, kind of good businesses and good managers have kind of got their ear close to the ground in terms of both their employee, but also in terms of what the market can offer. And I think it's always finding that balance, because we'd all like to do things differently, on a personal level, but we have to find the middle ground that suits the needs of everybody.
Okay. Jeff, let's continue a little bit on what Paul already mentioned. In a world where an employee may use a car, public transport, micro-mobility, EV charging, taxis, parking, sometimes all in one and the same week, what challenges does this really create for fleet managers, but also the finance executives in that organization, and how can they deal with it?
Yeah, so that broad range that you've talked about there, this increasing complexity, the theme of today's webinar about how do we get through this maze. I think the tension between increasing complexity, driven in part by exactly what Paul was talking about there, about the power of employees in terms of determining solutions that work for them, both from a convenience point of view, but also from a personal and corporate finance perspective. That's driving a challenge inherent in the question, which is about visibility. How do business leaders, fleet managers, finance execs, how do they get to see that visibility? And so if we just take one of those pillars, if you just look at car, we now have a situation increasingly, I'm sure many people who joined the webinar today will have a sort of a growing mixed fleet situation, historically coming from traditional company managed fleet, where the management and the responsibility sits in one place, to a much more disparate position where you now have mixed fleet. And using the example of car, you can have what we talked about already, the traditional company car managed by the organization. At the other end, you've now got in some markets up to 80% of employees thinking that they will use their vehicle, their personal vehicle, for work at some point in the year. And that might only be once or twice, it could be more regularly. But of course, the point of management of that vehicle, which is with the employee, and the point of responsibility when it's used for business, have become completely separate. And then if you add into that short, medium, sometimes long-term contracting, be it people visiting site or people working to go to plant or meetings, again, just understanding how an organization has visibility of these different use cases to get to the point where they understand, right, what are our risks? How do we get to match the need for the employee's convenience? Because as Paul said, they have a big voice, with the requirement for cost control. But as I think Neil touched on in his opening, what's interesting when you spread that out to look at, it could be everything from taxis and trains and scooters or whatever, the one thing that happens across every piece of business mobility is that there is a cost. And because there's a cost, there's a payment. And I think probably 5 years ago, there was a view that we're going to get these sort of multimodal apps that are going to deal with all of mobility. But what we're seeing is actually people are stuck in a lane. You've got trains and you book those in one place. You'll do stuff with vehicles elsewhere. And because they're in the lane, the thing that sits across the top of all those pillars is the payments piece. That's the bit that gives you the sort of stitched together visibility. So what's really key is to have the data, and the practical piece is really to say, right, how do I, as a fleet manager or as a CFO or as a risk manager or a compliance manager, how do I draw up my pen portraits of my use cases in my organization? Because they're flexing quite quickly, and sometimes they're not so visible because people are working from home or more flexible. So that's really sort of job number one, get that visibility, and then understand how across the top of the piece, it's really the payments piece that happens in every space that stitches it all together. Okay.
Neil, do you want to add something?
No, I think Jeff's absolutely correct. I think, if you think about policy, I think about micro-mobility, and if, you've got people traveling for work and they're using a scooter without a helmet in a city, is that something that they want to allow or not? And I think getting the grip of kind of the options and the types of mobility available, and again, like the grey fleet, how do we know, do they have, the vehicle has an MOT, are the tyres safe? I think there's so many elements that become outside of the fleet manager's control. So I think it's really good, if you can start to build that policy and strategy out internally. Yes, the payment comes, but having having the agreement of, what does good look like for travel. I think that's really important.
Okay. Now, sometimes I have the impression that payments are seen a little bit as a hidden friction point, reimbursement, wallet fragmentation, manual reconciliation, VAT issues, global compliance. It's not so easy. Why? And I would love to start and continue with you, Neil. Why is digitizing and unifying payments so essential to solving mobility complexity?
Yeah, I think so. Something I've always said at Visa is that we want payments to disappear. Now, we don't want payments to actually disappear, but the experience needs to no one wakes up in the morning wanting to make a payment. It's a necessity that needs to be done. So moving from that heavy friction and burden on the end user, which is disrupting to their day and frustrating, is really important. And so, we work very hard, things like contactless payments, working with wallets to be in Apple Pay and the Google Pays. Bringing the experience that you have in your everyday life is what you expect in your business travel as well. And I think in today's market, where you've got closed loop fuel cards on one hand, you've got people paying and claiming, you've got corporate cards, bringing all of that into one oversight is quite difficult. And so I guess from our vision perspective is that having a single card, and I touched on tokenization before, means that you've got a single source of truth. So whatever that driver or that employee does, I know it's them that's making the payment. Now, what that gives you the flexibility to do is embed that in 100 places. So in-car payments is growing at the moment. There's a lot of new companies that are working really well with the OEMs. I know you had a webinar recently covering that. So in-car payments is going to be important. Well, with a Visa card and the tokenization, I can embed that same card into the vehicle. I can embed it into Apple Pay. I can embed it into Google Pay. I can embed it into any parking app, any EV charging app. I can put it anywhere. I can pay payments online. No matter where that goes, it's secure under tokenization. But it also means that from a fleet manager perspective, that all comes back down into one place. So I think one credential with multiple form factors is going to be really important. I think then overlaying that with some of the AI technology that's coming in for predictive fraud, being able to protect against some of those challenges, and then the user experience, that's going to be really important. I think the other thing which an open loop payment method really helps with is, if I'm sat there as a fleet manager and I've got agency drivers, and then I've got the CEO, that I don't want to build or provide the same solution to both of those necessarily. So for example, the CEO may want to travel. So something that's really strong around open loop payments is that you can control which merchants the cards are spending. So we've got something called merchant category codes. So you can turn off merchant categories and really restrict down as to which types of payments can be made. So for example, for that agency driver, you might just want fuel, parking and tolls. But for the CEO, you might want to open hotels, for example, and other forms, Ubers and the taxis and other services. So again, that single solution, it doesn't mean I need to issue multiple cards. It's one card, and in the background, I can change all of those factors to build different profiles within my business. So like Jeff referred to about pen portraiting and building these profiles internally, the digital card solution allows you to do that. And then overlay that with setting limits on how much can be spent on each transaction, turning the card off over the weekend where it's not needed or not used. And then finally, I think virtual cards as well. So if I've got people that travel a few times a year, but then they're in a pay and claim situation, which can often mean late payments, so the employee is unhappy. It can mean late claiming, which means the fleet manager is unhappy. I can push a virtual card straight into someone's pay wallet. I can set the parameters around that. So for example, if they're traveling and they need a hotel for the night, I can do that. And then once that transaction's been made, that card is of no use to anyone and can't be used. So there's no risk of fraud. So I think, that underpinning of that payments element and making that level of flexibility is a really good basis point for then all of these great businesses to build out these great fleet management services and make that day-to-day job a lot easier than probably it is today.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Paul, what is your reaction on what Neil just said? And to continue, if the technology is already there, if the product is there, why aren't more organizations already using that one single digital payment solution?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, they're definitely aligned with Neil's comments there. The reality is payments have been around forever, and payments are certainly a source of friction in various different ways. The good thing about payments is it affects everybody, right? We all have to pay. And with that comes opportunity. And I think where we are today is the technological capabilities, the available data that can help you use payment solutions as a real source of competitive advantage for your business are better than they've ever been. So I don't think that, kind of as a business, people should be looking at it as a problem to solve. They should be looking at it as how can I use a payment solution per se to drive some form of efficiency. And by investing the time up front and by designing the right policies and the controls and the communication, I think it's a real value add for any company. Here at All Star, one of the things we see across multiple companies that use our services, it isn't one size fits all. In Neil's example, the CEO has a very different requirements to the management team, who has a different requirement to the delivery driver or to the sales rep. And so we're able to provide solutions, different types of solutions that suit all of those user cases, whether that be through using merchant category controls that the CEO could use a Visa card anywhere, but the kind of manager can only use it in certain instances, or whether it's giving the delivery driver a closed loop fuel card. But what we're able to do is to aggregate all of that data to provide reporting out to companies at employee level or vehicle level that give unique levels of visibility that people have never had before. And I think, as everybody appreciates in this day and age, data and analytics is the lifeblood for all of our businesses. That's what helps us to become more efficient. So I think it's a great opportunity to leverage the capabilities that are out there. And to your point about why isn't everybody using one kind of universal solution, it's complex, right? It's complex, and the technology that we're using is growing all of the time. And that's why I think it's really important for people to stay close to the environment and understand the art of the possible.
Okay, Jeff, the need for data and for accurate data is becoming even more key now that, for sure, in Europe, we are at the forefront of, limiting our CO2 footprint. There is ESG, CO2 monitoring, there is duty of care obligations. So more than ever, accurate real-time data is key. What role does a single payment stream or a single source of truth, like Neil already mentioned, play in enabling compliance and reporting?
Yeah, I think so. This is the sort of where things get both really interesting and also quite complicated. So the interesting piece is, if you think about purpose, a purpose of an organization, the business mobility is a value driver. Within that come all sorts of challenging contradictions about our impact, both on the immediate environment in terms of clean air, and, if you like, the broader issues that you're touching upon in terms of ESG, CO2. And what that does is it takes what has historically been what I think a lot of people on this call would be completely on top of, which is business mobility or fleet as in a particular part of the business. It really spreads it out to say, okay, if you're a HR manager, there are issues here around keeping employees on board. What does an employee benefit look like in context of all this? What does it look like as a risk manager? What does it look like as an ESG or in the finance team? So I think the interesting thing is that this spreads the challenge of being on top of business mobility, particularly in terms of the risk. So again, if we go back, we've touched on grey fleet, and you mentioned in your opening that 65% of European companies are seeing their fleet reducing, which means their business travel won't be reducing because the separation of workplace, be it at home or regional office, whatever, is we're seeing business mobility hasn't dropped off in the way that people thought it would post-pandemic, far from it. So what we've now got is this really interesting challenge about, well, what do you do about the stuff you historically haven't been able to see? If you've got a mixed fleet, if you've got up to 80% of people using their own resources, their own vehicles to get around, how do you understand and measure that ghost carbon that comes with grey fleet? You can't just sit there and say, well, we've got these huge targets, we're reporting to our board, we're reporting to the markets, yet we'll just sort of almost keep the lid on the tin, we'll just keep it shut. So these are really interesting challenges, but of course solutions exist. It's again about helping organizations very quickly understand, right, what's your mix, what's your mobility mix, right, let's get a single pane of glass over it so you can see the whole lot, and from there you can start making positive risk decisions. You can start understanding what your embedded emissions, but also those that are coming from ghost carbon, how you can measure all of that, whilst also understanding the sort of really knotty sort of compliance risks that keep boards, partners, companies, managers awake at night because they know they haven't got the visibility to understand how do we manage these risks.
Okay. Let's deep dive into some more specific use cases and also examples. We are, of course, living in an international, even global environment. So let's look globally. In Belgium, we have since a couple of years already the mobility budget that gives employees the chance to use a budget for multiple mobility modes in a really regulated framework. And in some cases, they can even pay part of their house rent with the mobility budget. We have, of course, also in other countries, evolutions when it comes to regulation and mobility. We have, for example, like we mentioned at the start, seen that in the UK, there is a new tax coming up for BEVs, a pay-per-use, pay-per-mile tax. Yes, we have in other countries other situations, and even beyond Europe, there are different examples that we can mention. Neil, what lessons can companies take from these models when designing flexible mobility programs? If you look, for example, at Belgium, if you look at France, if you look in the UK and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Belgium's one of the areas that I cover, and the federal mobility budget is really fascinating. I think if you think about what it's trying to drive, it's trying to prevent, it's trying to increase the shift to EV, but also giving people the alternative to get that vehicle off the road completely. Yeah, and I think the rent element to that, I mean, that's another whole level of complexity for a fleet manager. What does that mean for their relationship with the HR team as well? Because this starts to really blend between employee benefits and being a fleet manager. And so I think understanding those challenges, look, for me, I think we're only just starting this journey. And I think that's the big lookout here. You know, what's going on in Belgium, I'm sure will be looked at very keenly by other governments in other countries. So, you know, are we going to be in a situation where actually, if that's successful, that starts to roll out? So I think for me, it's having and partnering with suppliers that have the ability to adapt their platforms in order to, when these changes do come in, is they're able to quite quickly make those adaptations for you so that they continue to provide a solution which can change with the change in regulation. You talked about yesterday the 3 pence a mile. Well, how's that going to be facilitated now, and what do I have to do as a fleet manager? So I think the only thing we can guarantee is that it's always going to continue evolving and changing until we find a happy place and some consistency across that. So I think, picking partners, I think for me as well, there's an element of proactivity in this, because yes, I think it can come from the point that fleet managers are concerned everything's going on around them, but there is a chance to be proactive and look at some of these policies, look at the journeys and be proactive in setting, what are the right forms for my business, and actually can I use these new solutions which are coming to market, not only from very experienced players, like Paul at Corpay, but from the likes of Jeff as well, coming in, with great new technology for Car Cloud. So I think, having a head up and looking around those different opportunities, I think we can be assured there is a strong market of very talented people like this looking to solve the challenges that are being faced.
Okay. Paul, what lessons can you share? For example, the differences that you see UK versus Australia and New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Neil's point, there's a lot going on globally, the way that different countries are addressing different challenges, and just the announcement that we saw in the UK yesterday, this constant tension between sustainability and economics is going to create even more turbulence as we go forward. And it's interesting, the government has spent some time in the UK here incentivizing company car drivers to get into electric vehicles. It's been very tax advantageous. The problem is, for every driver that goes from a petrol or diesel car into an electric car, it costs the government about £1,000 a year in lost revenue. So clearly that was an unsustainable approach, and it had to be addressed, and they're addressing it through road pricing. New Zealand are ahead of the game. New Zealand introduced a similar scheme last year on road pricing for EV and hybrid vehicles. The difference with New Zealand is that they've always had a road pricing scheme for as long as I can remember for vehicles anyway. So it was a little bit of a different approach to the UK, where we have an annual road taxation policy. But the challenge with all of this stuff is it puts complexity and uncertainty into the workplace, into the business environment, and that's a problem. And especially when you're talking about mobility, because it has real tax implications from people personally as well as the companies. So to Neil's point, it really is where it kind of, it's corporate requirements, locking horns with HR policies and benefits and so forth. So I think across all of the geographies that we operate in, you are constantly having to weigh up the personal challenges and the impacts on employees, as well as the business, as well as what that might mean longer term. And I think EVs is just such a great example of where it is so complex and so challenged for the longer term. We've got large fleet companies, and we represent 75% of the top 200 fleets in the UK. We've got large companies stalling their vehicle replacement policies because they have no idea where the government policy will be next year or the year after. So it's a challenging situation.
Okay. Yeah, I can imagine. And it's not only in the UK, a challenging one. Jeff, let's continue. When you look at the topic of the discussion, when we look a little bit at those flexible digital first solutions, when it also comes to payment, do you witness that our ecosystem, our industry, your customers, your partners, that they are already taking action and in action? And can you share for an example?
Sure, yeah. An example, recent onboarding of a company, just under 150 vehicles, primarily company managed fleet, so traditional fleet, but also a significant number of grey fleet vehicles as well. And what's been interesting, and it's quite thinking about the topic of today's webinar, the whole point about a maze is you've got to plot your way through. You're going to go down some dead ends, perhaps, but you're going to learn and you're going to get through. But you can't get through unless you get in. You've got to get in. And the starting point for this company was very simply that they are quite heavily computerized, but not digitized. And what I mean by that is that there's spreadsheets all over the place managing vehicles, but none of it ties up. There's not that single point viewpoint. And getting that, just very simply putting that in, which is a really simple exercise, to put that single pane of glass across the whole of the vehicle and driver. It's the vehicle and driver mix. What's interesting, really three things. One is, at the most simple level, relief, visibility, primarily around compliance. that actually you can see everything in one place, and so there's a compliance piece. Second thing, interesting, is once you see all of that in one place, you start to think about cost controls, and particularly out of line situation around costs. It's very quick to start looking at cost controls, starting to chip away at cost. And then the third thing that I think is really important in this whole conversation is not to think about systems too much from the, if you like, B2B supply side, but recognize we're all consumers. Everybody on this call is a consumer. We might also be employees as well. And people expect the convenience and the frictionless nature of consumer level tools. They don't want what you might be called historically built for business, a bit clunky, a bit slow. It needs to work like everything else that they've got on their phone.
Okay, an interesting example. Going to Paul, what is an example that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting topic, Stephen. We've done some research last year, and we went out to 500 small and micro businesses with 1 to 5 employees, and they reckon that they're spending effectively a third of a person on a perpetual basis dealing with payment challenges of all kind of descriptions. And when you've only got between 1 and 5 employees, that's a massive pain point. So again, it comes back to the integration, the lens, the visibility of payments over one platform. And that's something we've invested a lot of time in, through whether that be through integrating our All-Star Plus, our Visa product, into closed loop products, into other forms of payment. But effectively, the biggest challenge here is around control and the time bureaucracy that the small and micro businesses have. So I think it's a critical challenge to address, because at that kind of size, businesses really want to be focusing on what they need to do to drive revenue, not doing paperwork and administration.
Okay, perfect. Gentlemen, before that, we go to the final part of this webinar, where the audience, the participants, can ask questions. So to the audience, if you have a question, submit your question via the chat. There is one final question before our Q&A based on the question from the audience that I would like to ask you. Looking a little bit into the future, what does the future look like in, let's say, 3 to 5 years from now? Will we see more subscription-based vehicles, more EV charging integration, employer mobility wallets, even mobility as a service becoming now really the norm? What is your thought about it, and what role does a platform approach play in there? Neil?
Yeah, look, I think, and this goes for all businesses, and I don't think that we're exempt from this. I think it's breaking down the blurs between those different verticals. So I think Jeff touched on it, that there's a lot of people solving in different spaces. I think, you know, the blur between what's an employee benefit, what's the fleet manager, what's the HR, and all of these different elements, you know, we need to look at the end users and what their needs are and the business's needs. And so I think for me, we're going to see greater clarity around bringing some of those solutions together. So you've got a suite of solutions for your employees. I think for me that it's very much building blocks. I think there's so much great work going on in this space. It really is. And we see it every day. We're very fortunate to work with these partners. I also don't think anyone can do it on their own. I haven't seen anyone that's going to solve mobility single-handedly. I think everyone that is launching into these spaces is reliant on partners. Now, whether that's because you've got a great technology piece, you know, where are you getting the additional data? Well, you need a telematics provider and partner. You know, do you want to issue a payment card? Well, you don't want to become a bank, so then you're going to need a partner to work with you to issue the card. So I'm very much thinking and seeing that these building blocks are in place. It's now the next 3 to 5 years is bringing them together, partnering into the market in order to support the fleet managers and scale across Europe, and of course with all the nuances that you have within each market. Okay,
Jeff, what is your vision for the future?
So if we look at the lessons of the last 3 to 5 years, then what we've seen is slightly accelerated by the pandemic, but in digital terms, it was happening already. This massive increase in the requirement for things to work to some degree conveniently on employees' terms, and at the same time, the economic self-interest, as we're sort of touching upon around the budget in the UK, but of course across all markets, that tension between convenience and economic self-interest, I think means that we are going to see solutions being perhaps more driven by workforce and employees than we perhaps previously thought. So some of these solutions, so if you think about mobility as a service, it's a really, really interesting proposition, but understanding how that is going to land in real terms versus people dealing with the mix of the transport assets they have in their life, be they on demand like a taxi or a train or a scooter or their own asset. I think that's going to be the really interesting space. And as I think Neil has touched upon, what we're seeing is the emergence really quite quickly of tools that allow organizations to focus in on that in a way that simplifies rather than adds to complexity, to pick up Paul's point about spending more time either cutting cost or generating revenue, but not administering what is an increasingly complex situation.
Okay. Paul, where do you see the holy grail for mobility and also more flexibility and digital-first solutions in the upcoming years?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a big need for simplification, and the bad news is it gets more complicated. Back in the day, I used to jump in my car and fill up with petrol and drive where I want, and that was that. Now I can charge my electric vehicle on the road. I can charge it at home. I can charge it in the workplace. I can drive into city centres. I can pay a congestion charge, or I can take the train. I can do all other kinds of things. So lots and lots of complexity. And I think to Jeff's point, employees are demanding flexibility to be able to do what works best, which is kind of important. The great thing is the amount of controls and the use of technology to get better control over that is increasing all of the time. So I think kind of the solution providers are responding to the market challenges, and I think as we go forward, there's going to be far more smarts, far more technical capability to make sure people can optimize mobility in every shape or form. It's needed, but I think the market's responding, which is great news.
Okay. Neil, question about data security and also platform security. What can you share about that? Because I can imagine that some people, fleet managers, organizations, in the context that we are living in today, that they can also have some questions about in what way is a single digital platform robust enough from a data security perspective. What can you say?
Yeah, look, I think from a payments perspective, Visa is built on security. It's essential. It's in everything that we do. So we're doing a lot of work. We're investing a lot in AI actually within Visa. We're a huge adopter of it. We're able to use that in order to spot and forecast and predict fraud, for example. The security that we have within our network and the two-factor authentication means there's very low fraud rates through that. And if you add that to biometric capabilities such as Apple Pay and Google Pay, then again, it becomes more secure. I think tokenization, what that gives you is a single-use token. So where we see in some other payment use cases that are not through kind of open loop rails is that you have a static number. So you have the ability that could be copied or could be identified, and potentially fraud could take place on that. Whereas on the tokenization, it's always a single usage. So once that token's been used, then there's no risk of that being used further. So I think we invest heavily into all of these elements across that. And then, of course, from a data perspective, that's shared securely in the four-party model that we have through acquiring bank and issuing bank as well. So I think we see that as the most secure way in order to make payments in the market.
Okay, Paul, what can you say about the appetite for collaboration and partnerships in this ecosystem, in this industry? Because Neil already pointed out, and I think that everyone can agree, that you can't solve the mobility problem challenge on your own, that you need to do it with reliable partners. On the other hand, of course, this is a corporate environment. There is competition. Yes. Is there enough, let's say, openness and willingness to collaborate in this field?
Yeah, I think it's always a challenge between, companies wanting their competitive advantage and being able to leverage their own positions, but also, kind of from a market standpoint, wanting the best solution, which invariably requires collaboration. I think because the landscape is so much more complicated, I think there has to be collaboration. I think companies are typically responding. Without question, it's not a completely transparent ecosystem and everybody's, we're all in it together. But I think there's definitely a lot more collaboration than we've seen before. And I think Visa is a great example of where they kind of stand in the middle and they work with people like Jeff, they work with people like ourselves, and it enables us to go to market with genuine value add for people seeking mobility.
Okay. A question for you, Jeff. And I want then also the others to complement your answer. If I am managing a company and I'm just starting to rethink mobility, what's the first step that I should take or think about? And how can I then afterwards scale it without too much complexity?
So it's a bit of a repeat of what we touched on before, Steve, but I think the first job is to map use cases, for mobility use cases. So just understand across an organization, perhaps in the sort of darker corners of areas where people might not normally go. So how does that actual employee, how do they go about their work if they're using, in effect, mobility as part of a value driver for the business, but in whatever shape that is? And that may be that could be at the level of a community nurse visiting somebody for in-home care as much as it is somebody going to a board meeting. So that mapping of the now situation and then overlaying what individuals, fleet managers and others within companies are beginning to understand about what they're hearing from their audience, the management employee workforce. What are they hearing about what they think or what people are starting to tell them they would like to be able to do, so that you then very simply map and now and then future or near future scenarios, but really at quite a granular level of what does that look like for these individuals? What do they actually do? And then from that, and I think this touches on the collaboration question that you were just asking of Paul, which is what we've, and coming back to that question, I think the reason that we're seeing such great collaboration around the Visa Fleet and Fuel Initiative is because on the fleet manager and company side, nobody has got the capacity to be dealing with 14 different organizations to deal across this huge breadth of what people will find when they start mapping out these issues, that people will constantly balance their personal convenience and their economic self-interest to make decisions about how they effectively use mobility or in effect activate business mobility, how they get around for work. So I think that's the key thing is the mapping piece is now, future, but really at quite a granular level, quite a basic exercise of understanding that, and then overlaying that. The task then is to get that singular view. How do I look across all of that mix and understand I've actually got for the first time this all in one place? Then from that I can start making decisions about that tension between convenience, mainly on the employee side, but also on the management side, cost and control, constant triangle of working that space.
Okay. Paul, for you, if we then go to the implementation phase and there is, let's say, the mobility landscape is in place, where do you start with, let's say, defining the payment needs that you need as a company, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think employee engagement is critical. You know, understanding what your team needs, how they need to get around, where you could add some value. I think sometimes it can be easy to over governance these situations, and I think trust is an important part around the workplace as much as control. So I think you need to balance up, kind of how granular you do go, because I agree with Jeff's point. You need to kind of have a good eye over what your risks are and what you need to deliver from a business standpoint. But I think creating that framework so that it kind of works for everybody is key. But look, it's not complicated. There's a lot of solutions out there, and a lot of it is logic. But if you're aware of what the solutions are, you're aware of what your team needs, I think you can respond to those challenges pretty smartly.
Okay. And Neil, final word for you. What would be your main advice to the fleets and the fleet managers here in the room when they think about matching mobility with payment and how to go forward to make everything more seamless and more effortless?
No, I think, in my experience in these things, it's starting with your pain points, because I think everyone's busy within their day-to-day job. So if you think about today, it's trying to make the best of probably quite a challenging situation. I think for me, change comes when you've got real pain. So identifying the things which are really causing problems. So is that problems for you as a business in reporting? Is it employee experience, which is causing a lot of frustration? Understanding what they are, what the cost is to the business, and prioritizing them, I think it's a really good place to start, because I think everyone needs a bit of a business case for change. I think, if any big business is going to invest in change, is going to want to know that there's going to be a beneficial return. So I think understanding what those problems are, what the inefficiencies are, what they're costing, and then using that as a basis to be able to kind of come up, with the strategy that Jeff referred to. And then I think, to Paul's point, and the partners that are out there, they're used to helping fleet managers. Corpay have got so much experience helping fleet managers in this space, and they'll be able to support with that business case. What does this efficiency drive? Does it save the employees time? What time is that value to the company? So I think, yes, there's always probably going to be an investment element. So I think being clear and building that business case is going to be a great place to start. But no one's alone in this. There's a lot of people that can support on that journey.
Okay. And of course, also Visa can support you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having joined this webinar, for sharing your expertise. Thank you to Neil Holes of Visa. Also, thank you to Paul Holland of Corpay and to Jeff Terrell of CarCloud. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you can see your way through the mobility maze a little bit more clear. Thank you very much for joining, and I hope to see you at the next episode of the Fleet Europe webinar. Thank you and bye-bye.